My name is Brad Gilmer. I'm the Executive Director of the IP Showcase, and I want to talk to you about a unique opportunity that we had to do some security vulnerability scanning with the equipment that is in this room. So let's get started. I want to talk about the goals of the testing that we did. And anytime you do any kind of security scanning, you better start with goals, otherwise you're going to have a problem interpreting the results. I want to talk about the unique opportunity that we had here. I want to describe the methodology, the rules, the tooling that I used. I want to give you a high-level results summary, and I want to talk about potential weaknesses in the scanning as well. So that's what I'll be talking about. So the JTNM, along with its other partners on this sign over here at the top, had specific goals with relation to the security vulnerability scanning that we did here. First of all, we wanted to produce security recommendations that really led to an appreciable improvement in the security in the industry, not just publish another list of things that people should do. The second thing is we wanted to focus on low-hanging fruit. We had a feeling that there were a few concrete things that manufacturers and broadcasters could do that would substantially improve security. That was our hypothesis. We wanted to test that. We also wanted to keep it simple. Security can be a very complicated topic. We really wanted to keep it simple. Our progress so far is that we've made requests to the JTNM coordination group with regard to PTP security, and you'll hear a presentation from Willem from the EBU about that after I'm done talking. And we've also made another request to the coordination group with regard to API security, and that has led to an activity within the NMOS community about securing APIs. And then we have a draft that we're working on that Willem will talk more about on vulnerability scanning. That's in process, but it's informed by the work that we did here. So let's talk about this unique opportunity that we had and the vulnerability scanning that we did. As you can see from the picture here, we had over 50 companies with a lot of IP-based equipment in a room in Wuppertal. And we had the opportunity, as the JTNM, to conduct vulnerability scanning from the outside of those systems, just as an attacker might do if they first wanted to survey the landscape and see what opportunities there were to attack the equipment that's in this room. It's the largest, and this right here, by the way, is the largest variety of IP-based professional media equipment that has ever been assembled anywhere, period. And we had an opportunity to do, the first time ever, to do vulnerability scanning against it. The key goal was to come up with tooling and a methodology that allowed manufacturers and users to run these tests themselves. It's not that we want to, as the JTNM, police the industry. Instead, what we want the industry to do is to police themselves in this area using some fairly common terminology and tooling. And we would expect to see an improvement over time. If we're public about what we have done, if we work with the EBU to get the word out about the methodology that we used and so on, we would expect to see an improvement over time in the results of the vulnerability scanning that we did. So this is the first industry-wide use of vulnerability scanning, and we're seeking to validate the methodology, the tooling, and the overall approach that we took here. And I want to make it clear that this is a partnership between the user community, the manufacturers, the system integrators, to do the scanning and get feedback from people about how the scan worked and how the results worked, so that we can improve this and get more reliable results. Specifically with regard to the vulnerability scanning goals, we wanted to scan as many of the systems that you see in this room as we possibly could in the time that was available. We wanted to identify some Harry Potter terminology here, howlers, things that were just obvious security issues. We didn't want to nitpick, right? We wanted to pick problems, identify problems that just about anybody, manufacturer, user, SI, anybody would say, you know, that's probably not the best thing to find. We wanted to share detailed, specific results with the vendors privately so that they have an opportunity to tell us if the scanning was invalid, but also to look at their systems, and if it is valid vulnerabilities, to give them an opportunity privately to improve that. We're not trying to publicly shame anyone. And we agreed that we would share the results here at IBC publicly so that generally, anonymously, you know at a high level where we are, so that we set an initial point and then we can see, is there improvement over time? So as I said, validating the tooling and methodology is a partnership, especially with our vendors. And also we may add some level of security checking as an entrance or participation criteria in future industry events that we might do. But we're not doing that now because we don't know for sure if the tooling actually works and the methodology is sound yet. So, let's talk about the tooling. What does it take to scan all this equipment? Not much. Not much. This is absolute overkill right here. So this is an Intel NUC. It's a i5 dual core. It's got 16 gig of memory in it. It's got a 300 gig flash drive. And that is more processing, more memory, and more drive space than you need to do the job. But this is what we used. By the way, could somebody get this into your facility potentially and set it on a shelf in a data cabinet somewhere and plug it in and run it remotely? I don't know, it's not that big. And you can do this on a Raspberry Pi. Is that what you did? This is exactly what I did. The operating system that's on this thing is a specific security distribution of Linux. It's called Kali Linux. It's a rolling distribution. So one of the things that we're trying to do here is to enable you guys to run these scans yourself. What you need to know is that what I did to be sure that I had a static testing environment is I turned off all the automatic software updating in this machine. I updated it manually on the 22nd of August, 2018, and I did no more updates of it during the time I was doing the scanning because I didn't want my basically testing bar to be moving around as I was running the testing. In terms of the software tooling, I used Nmap and OpenVAS. Nmap is a command line port scanner, open source, freely available. OpenVAS is an open source, freely available, menu-driven vulnerability scanner. So these are the two things that I used. Why OpenVAS primarily is the tool. First of all, it's got a solid reputation. Second of all, it's open source. Third of all, it's free, and who doesn't love free, especially in our industry? Fourth, it's constantly updated. I mean, massive amounts of effort go into constantly updating this thing. It has very good test coverage. On this machine are over 45,000 vulnerability testing individual network vulnerability tests, or NVTs. It has a large community behind it in terms of open source. And frankly, it was recommended by the AMWA EBU Security Task Force security professionals who are CISOs in a lot of broadcast operations. So those are the reasons that we chose this tooling. The workflow that I did for each vendor, for every, not just each vendor, let's just leave it at that, was to identify the live IP addresses on the network, set up a scan target based on the IPs that were active, set up the tasks, the specific things that were going to be executed against those IPs, analyze the results, send the results to the vendor, get on an airplane, and while I was on the way here, write the presentation that you're seeing now. So that's kind of how things work. Identify live IP addresses. This is an actual traceroute map of the network you see in this room. There are a lot of nodes in here. There are over 50 vendors. They were assigned hundreds of IP addresses, and each vendor was assigned multiple IP addresses, but the vendors didn't use all of the IP addresses that were available. And to scan non-used IP addresses, oddly enough, actually takes longer than scanning active ones, because the assumption of the scanner is you're trying to hide. So I'm going to spend more time trying to find you, right? So what I really wanted to do was I wanted to quickly identify the live IP addresses, and this is very different from doing a deep dive vulnerability assessment on a single box. So let's just be clear about that. So in order to identify the live IP addresses, if you get Nmap and you load it on a system and you type nmap-sn-og, file name, IP address range, what you're going to get is a greppable file that sits out on the drive. I wrote a simple bash script that greps for the term up, like the network interface is up, and I did some cutting and trimming and dropping the thing into another file, and the result is just one IP address per line per host in a text file. You take that, and then you go into OpenVAS, and you say, I want to set up a scan target. What IP addresses should I be checking? I import from the file the set of IP addresses that I needed, and then the other thing that I did that was different from the default in OpenVAS is I chose the own port list that I was going to scan to Nmap 5.51 top 2,000 TCP ports and top 100 UDP ports. Yes, I was scanning 2,100 ports on every IP address of every vendor in this room. This is interesting. A guy that uses the online name Fedor is the guy who wrote Nmap, and he goes out and constantly scans the internet and identifies the most common IP ports. So this is not a linear list starting at port 1 and going to port 2,000. It's him scanning the internet, saying, these are the most commonly found ports, and then here's the top 2,000 of those. So those are the ports that I scanned. Once I did that, it yielded a target, vendor A. Here's the 3 IP addresses that I found, and here's the scanning ports that I'm going to use here, right? So now I've got the IP addresses set up. What's the task? What am I going to go do against those IPs? So then you select that scan target that I just showed you in the last slide. The scan config I used was full and fast, because full and really slow and very deep sounded like a losing proposition trying to scan hundreds of IP addresses here. But this has to do with how many network vulnerability tests you actually execute against each IP address. This is what I chose. If you want to do this and duplicate my results, choose that. And you run the task. So down here there's a little go button, a stop button, a throw it in the trash button, and at the end it says done, and you get a result which will tell you how many tasks are running, how many vulnerabilities were found, and so on. A few facts about this room. I had 20 hours to do this. I didn't stay up for 20 hours. I came in for 2 days, but I took 20 hours of actual scanning time. This box scanned 124 IP addresses. This box scanned 2,098 ports per IP address. That means it scanned a total in 20 hours of 260,152 ports. The total number of network vulnerability tests available on this machine are 46,663 ways I can try and break into your box. The average number of NVTs that were really executed against each IP address of each vendor's piece of equipment was 3,450 of those. So the approximate total number of network vulnerability tests this little thing executed in 20 hours was 427,800 vulnerability tests against the equipment in this room. That would be a lot of times to knock on the door and see if anybody answers, right? The number of IPs that this box can scan at the same time is 4. And on those 4 IP addresses, the number of concurrent network vulnerability tests it can run are 20. This is a really wimpy box. This thing can be distributed. I could put 20 of these boxes in a facility. I could execute millions of scans in 20 hours with very little hardware. This is what an actual result looks like. It will produce a report, and that's what I sent to the vendors. But this is an actual result that you get. You'll note that one of the nice things about the tool is that you got red, yellow, and blue. Not green, but you got red, yellow, and green vulnerability results. So it's pretty easy, like maybe we should focus on the red stuff first. Good idea. The results are by IP address. This has been blurred out here, but the reason that we've got multiple results of the same sort is because that same vulnerability was found in several IP addresses of that vendor's equipment. It doesn't mean that one box was vulnerable 4 times. It means there were 4 separate IP addresses that that vendor had deployed, and they deployed the same vulnerability 4 times. The specific network vulnerability tests are identified, and you can actually cursor over on any of these in OpenVAS and click on it, and it will give you information about what it was trying to do. So, one of the deals that we had with all the vendors in this room is that we would not shame anybody. We would talk about what the general results were when I scanned everything, but we're not calling anybody out. So out of the 124 IPs that I checked, I found 115 vulnerabilities that were classified as not good to have at all. They're high vulnerabilities. I found 293 vulnerabilities that are rated as medium. I found 144 vulnerabilities that are listed as low. And in the meantime, OpenVAS wrote 3,998 log entries that are just pieces that you might want to know about what was going on during the scanning. So these really aren't vulnerabilities. Some summary results. Some of the top vulnerabilities we found in this room, and so I would guess some of the top vulnerabilities you will find in your equipment if you're a vendor, or in equipment that a vendor brings you, or if you're an SI or you're a user, was the operating system was end of life. If you're using an old version of an operating system, hackers have had more time to beat on it. Therefore, it's more likely that it's more vulnerable. HTTP directory transversal. If I go into a web browser you're running on your system and I type /http, blah, 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 your IP address, // // // // /password. If you've got this vulnerability, your computer system takes you as high up in the directory structure as it can, and then it goes, boom, takes you all the way up to the root, and then it takes you down to etc, and then it takes you down to the password file, and you can download the password file where you can run a cracker program on it to crack the passwords that are stored in that file. SSH login with default credentials. Some SSH distributions are sent out with default logins. These particular vendors didn't change, admin password to something else. Windows administrator account with a null FTP password. Fail. PHP denial of service. There are certain things that you can pass to PHP in some older versions of PHP that will cause it to crash the machine. Maybe an attacker's objective is not to get into the machine. Maybe their objective is just to take you off the air. That would do it. It's called, they're able to crash the heap memory is that particular vulnerability. Eclipse, which is a very common development system, has something called a Jetty server. There's something called a pipeline request vulnerability, which basically allows you to chuck this particular thing at the Jetty server, and it goes, would you like complete access to this system without having to tell me who you are or type in a password? Here you go. Maybe that wouldn't be a good thing. So I think the point of showing you this, and that we actually found that, is not, oh my God, there's all these things here. It's that, yep, we proved without a doubt that there are things that are pretty undeniably not that wonderful, that are actually pretty easy to fix, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But this is an example of that Jetty server fake pipeline request. If you click on that in the results, this tells you, here was the detection result, here's the impact, in other words, what it lets you do, here's the affected software, here's some insight into it, and here's, if you upgrade your Eclipse Jetty server to this other version, this problem goes away. Again, low-hanging fruit, right? You got this vulnerability, here's a tool that tells you, well, if you just upgrade Jetty to this version, rerun this, and this ought to go away. Easy. It's important to note, when I looked around here, that not all of the hosts had the same level of vulnerability. So what that means is, importantly, it may be that in a real-world deployment, as a system integrator, as a manufacturer, as a user, you may be able to identify 2 or 3 systems where if you really go attack those systems, you can substantially lower the overall vulnerability that you have in your plant. So in this particular example, and this OpenVAS will generate this result for you, these are blurred out IP addresses, but I know exactly which IP addresses belong to these bars here, and if I go fixed A, B, and C, you can see if we took that away, the overall number of vulnerabilities per box would drop substantially. We should do that. What are some potential issues with doing this scan? And with anything, there are potential issues. So one, of course, is a false positive, and this is where we need a partnership with the vendors. And that's why we gave the very detailed results to the vendor. We think that your box is vulnerable to this attack. Would you please go check and see if it is? If you check your box and you're telling me you're not even running Eclipse, but you got an Eclipse Jetty vulnerability result, tell me. We need to know that the tool has problems. False negatives. You do not know what you do not know. So this is actually a bad one. If you have a vulnerability, but the tool tells you you don't have that vulnerability, that's also very bad. And so if manufacturers know that they have a particular vulnerability, but that didn't show up in the report I sent them, we need to know that, because we need to know the tooling isn't doing the job. Another potential issue is not understanding what the tooling is doing. And that's really on anyone who is using the thing, but especially for system integrators and users who start this thing. If you really don't understand what the tool does, you may falsely accuse a manufacturer of having some problem that they don't have. So we need to understand the tool. Goes the same for incorrectly interpreting the results. You need to spend the time looking at the interfaces. OpenVAS is pretty easy to understand, but you do need to invest a little bit of time to understand what the screens are showing you. And our last one is vulnerability issues that are there by design. And the issue of security overall really needs to be a partnership between the user community, the SIs, and the vendors. One vendor has already come to me and said, yeah, we send usernames and passwords over HTTP rather than HTTPS in the clear because we don't want our users to constantly have to add that certificate warning. If you've ever seen that, you know what I'm talking about. But add a security exception to let that through. That's confusing to people. This is a design choice we made. Now that that's been disclosed, the user and the manufacturer and the SI can talk about whether they actually want it that way, but this vulnerability was there on purpose, right? So it's just a discussion, but you shouldn't just smack the vendor when you don't understand what their assumptions are. I should say that there were no specific issues identified with OpenVAS so far. So far, the tooling looks solid, the results look solid. A few closing thoughts. Every one of you can do this. Every one of you. It's possible to scan very large facilities in a reasonable amount of time. That's the second thing that came out of this. We thought that serious vulnerabilities with simple fixes would exist. That is true. Good news is, all we have to do is decide that it's important enough to fix them. We plan to publish this information as a paper. Willem and I have been talking about how to do that, but I would like to publish some more fuller results, especially around what the tooling was and how it was used, so that you can pick that up and really just take it and go run it. And the goal really, again, I just can't overemphasize this enough. This is a partnership. The goal is to improve security for the industry, generally speaking, over time. That's it. Thank you very much.